"I don't care what it costs, just make it happen," Blake Whitmore barked into his phone, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his 15th-floor Manhattan penthouse. The morning sun caught his platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, despite the early hour, and reflected off the Rolex Daytona that cost more than most people's cars. At 52, Blake had built an empire on a simple philosophy. Everything and everyone had a price, and he had enough money to buy whatever he wanted. His real estate company, Whitmore Holdings, owned half of downtown Manhattan, and today he was flying to London to close the biggest deal of his career, an $800 million property acquisition that would cement his legacy as one of the most powerful men in international real estate. Blake adjusted his Italian silk tie and walked through his penthouse, a monument to his success that sprawled across 3,000 square feet of prime Park Avenue real estate. The walls were lined with photographs of him shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, and other titans of industry, each image carefully curated to project power and influence. His breakfast sat untouched on the marble kitchen island prepared by his private chef, but ignored because Blake was too focused on the day ahead to eat. The phone call he'd just finished was with his London contact, confirming that the final documents would be ready for signing at 10 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning. This deal wasn't just about money, though the numbers were staggering enough to make even Blake's accountants nervous with excitement. It was about proving that Blake Whitmore could operate on any stage in any country and bend the most sophisticated business minds in the world to his will. He walked to his massive walk-in closet, selecting his armor for the day. A charcoal gray suit that cost $12,000, handcrafted by a tailor in Milan who had dressed 3 generations of European royalty. The shirt was Egyptian cotton, the shoes were crocodile leather from a boutique in Florence, and the cufflinks were platinum with diamonds that caught the light like tiny stars. Blake understood that image was everything, that people made decisions about your worth in the first 30 seconds of meeting you, and he had never lost a negotiation because he looked like anything less than exactly what he was, a man who owned whatever room he walked into. His driver would arrive in 20 minutes to take him to JFK Airport, where he would board Flight 847 to London in Seat 2, a first-class window seat, exactly where a man of his stature belonged. Blake had specifically called the airline's concierge service to ensure that the seat next to him remained empty, paying an extra fee he could afford without thinking, because he valued his personal space and privacy above almost everything else. The London deal was the culmination of 3 years of careful maneuvering, strategic investments, and the kind of high-stakes negotiations that separated the truly powerful from the merely wealthy. Blake's company would be acquiring a portfolio of historic properties in Mayfair and Knightsbridge buildings that had housed British nobility for centuries and would now serve as luxury hotels and private residences for the global elite. It was the kind of deal that would make headlines in the Financial Times and cement his reputation as a player on the international stage. Blake picked up his briefcase, a custom piece made from the same Italian leather as his shoes, and checked its contents one final time: contracts, financial projections, and a bottle of Dom Perignon that he planned to open the moment the deal was signed. He had waited his entire career for this moment, this validation that he had transcended his middle-class origins in suburban New Jersey and become something greater, something that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. As he waited for his driver, Blake looked out at the city sprawling beneath him, millions of people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that high above them decisions were being made that would shape the skyline they saw every day. He thought about his philosophy that you are who you surround yourself with, and he had spent decades carefully curating his circle to include only the most successful, the most connected, and the most useful people he could find. The phone buzzed with a text from his driver downstairs, and ready Mr. Whitmore. Blake grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, already mentally rehearsing the presentation he would give to the British investors tomorrow morning. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours a single conversation would destroy everything he had built, strip away the carefully constructed image he had spent decades creating, and teach him that some prices are too high to pay, even for a man who had always believed that everything was for sale. Dr. Elijah Washington pulled off his surgical gloves and looked down at the 8-year-old boy sleeping peacefully on the operating table, his tiny chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that meant the surgery had been successful. It was 4:30 in the morning at Harlem Hospital, and Elijah had just completed his third emergency surgery in 18 hours, but the exhaustion he felt was overwhelmed by the satisfaction of knowing that another child would live to see their next birthday. At 48, Elijah had performed more than 3,000 heart surgeries, saved more lives than he could count, and built the Washington Heart Institute from a single-room clinic in Detroit into one of the most respected cardiac programs in the world. But he still felt the same surge of gratitude every time he saw a patient's vital signs stabilize, the same quiet amazement that his hands had been guided to repair something as complex and fragile as a human heart. Elijah had grown up in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, in a house where his mother worked double shifts at the Ford plant and his father drove a delivery truck for a local bakery. They had never had much money, but they had given him something more valuable, the absolute conviction that education was the key to changing not just his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. His parents had saved every penny to buy him books, had sat with him at the kitchen table every night helping with homework. They didn't always understand, and had never once suggested that his dreams of becoming a doctor were too big for a kid from their neighborhood. Harvard Medical School had been a culture shock for a young man who had never owned a suit or eaten in a restaurant that required reservations. But Elijah had found his place in the operating room where skill and dedication mattered more than social connections or family wealth. He had graduated at the top of his class and could have taken any position at any prestigious hospital in the country. But he had chosen to return to Detroit, to the communities that had raised him, because he believed that everyone deserved access to world-class medical care, regardless of their zip code or their ability to pay. The Washington Heart Institute treated more than 200 children every year, many of them from families who could never afford the kind of specialized surgery their children needed. Elijah had structured the program so that no child was ever turned away for financial reasons, funding the shortfall through speaking engagements, private donations, and his own salary, which he had never raised, despite offers from private hospitals that would have tripled his income. Today's surgery had been particularly challenging. A 4-year-old girl with a rare congenital defect that required a technique Elijah had developed himself and published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The procedure had taken 6 hours, and there had been moments when the child's vital signs had dipped so low that the surgical nurses had looked at him with expressions that said they were preparing for the worst. But Elijah had stayed calm, had trusted his training and his instincts, and had guided the child back from the edge with patience and precision. Now, he was preparing for an even more challenging case, one that had brought him to the attention of cardiac surgeons across the globe. Tomorrow, in London, at the Royal Brompton Hospital, he would attempt to repair the heart of an 8-year-old girl named Emma Williams, who had been born with a defect so rare that only 3 cases had ever been documented in medical literature. The British doctors had exhausted every option available to them and had reached out to Elijah as their last hope, having read his research on experimental techniques for congenital heart repair. Elijah walked to the small office adjacent to the surgical suite and sat down at his desk, which was cluttered with patient files, medical journals, and photographs of children whose lives he had saved over the years. The centerpiece of the desk was a worn leather medical bag that had belonged to his father, a gift given on the day Elijah graduated from medical school. His father had saved for 2 years to buy that bag, working overtime shifts at the bakery and skipping meals to put aside the money for something that he believed would represent everything his son had achieved. The flight to London was scheduled to depart JFK at 8:15 in the evening, and Elijah had been surprised when the hospital's travel coordinator informed him that he had been upgraded to first class. He usually flew coach partly out of habit and partly because he felt uncomfortable with luxury that seemed unnecessary. But the hospital administrator had insisted, saying that a surgeon of his caliber deserved to arrive in London, rested and ready for what might be the most important surgery of his career. Elijah packed his medical bag carefully, including the surgical instruments he preferred to use for pediatric cases. Instruments that had been crafted specifically for his hands and techniques. He also packed the file on Emma Williams, though he had already memorized every detail of her condition, every scan and measurement that would guide tomorrow's surgery. This wasn't just another case for him. It was a chance to push the boundaries of what was possible to pioneer a technique that could save other children with similar conditions around the world. As he prepared to leave the hospital, Elijah thought about the phone call he'd had with Emma's parents the night before, their voices breaking with hope and fear as they described their daughter's courage through months of medical uncertainty. Emma had told her mother that she wasn't scared because the doctor from America is going to fix my heart so I can run and play like other kids. That trust, that faith in his abilities was both humbling and inspiring, and it reminded him why he had chosen medicine in the first place. The taxi ride to JFK would take 45 minutes in evening traffic, and Elijah planned to use the time to review the surgical plan one final time to visualize every step of the procedure he would perform in less than 24 hours. He had no way of knowing that his flight would never leave the ground, that a conversation with a stranger would change the trajectory of both their lives, and that sometimes the most important healing happens not in an operating room, but in the simple act of standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the JFK airport terminal as two very different men made their way through the crowds of travelers, each carrying the weight of important business, but approaching their journey in distinctly different ways. Blake Whitmore strode through the VIP entrance with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted, while Dr. Elijah Washington moved quietly through the main terminal, helping an elderly woman with her luggage, despite being pressed for time himself. Blake's arrival at the airport was a carefully orchestrated performance of wealth and status. His driver had dropped him at the curb with military precision, and a uniformed airport representative immediately appeared to escort him through the premium passenger entrance, bypassing the security lines that ordinary travelers endured. Blake's luggage was handled by white-gloved staff members who treated his belongings with the reverence typically reserved for museum artifacts, and within 15 minutes of arriving at JFK, he was seated in the first-class lounge, sipping 18-year-old scotch and reviewing the contracts that would make him $800 million richer by tomorrow evening. The lounge was Blake's natural habitat, a space designed for people who measured their worth in net worth and considered privacy a luxury they had earned through their success. He surveyed the other passengers with the calculating eye of a predator, assessing potential threats or opportunities, mentally cataloging their watches, their shoes, their posture, and their conversations to determine who was worthy of his attention and who was merely taking up space in his environment. Meanwhile, Elijah was navigating the standard passenger experience with the grace and patience that had made him beloved by his patients and colleagues alike. He had arrived at the airport 90 minutes before his flight, waited in line at security like everyone else, and spent the extra time in the gate area reading medical journals and responding to emails from his surgical team. When he noticed an elderly woman struggling with a suitcase that was clearly too heavy for her to manage alone, he immediately stood up and offered to help, lifting her bag into the overhead compartment of the gate area seating with the same gentle care he used when handling a patient's heart. The woman, grateful for his kindness, had tried to offer him money for his assistance, but Elijah declined with a smile that reminded her of her own grandson. Just helping a fellow traveler, he had said simply, and the woman spent the rest of her wait telling other passengers about the kind doctor who had made her journey a little easier. Elijah didn't think anything of it. Helping others was as natural to him as breathing, a reflexive response that came from growing up in a community where neighbors looked out for each other and no one succeeded alone. Blake, observing this interaction from across the gate area, felt a familiar surge of irritation at what he perceived as weakness. In his worldview, helping strangers was a waste of time and energy that could be better spent on activities that provided measurable returns on investment. He watched Elijah with the same disgust he might reserve for someone who left money on the table or failed to negotiate the best possible deal, seeing kindness as a character flaw that separated successful people from those who would always struggle to get ahead. When the boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, Blake was among the first passengers to approach the gate, flashing his diamond-level frequent flyer card and his first-class boarding pass with the satisfaction of someone who had never waited in line for anything in his adult life. He boarded the Boeing 777 with the swagger of ownership, nodding curtly to the flight attendant, who greeted him by name and immediately began making demands about the temperature, the lighting, and the positioning of his seat. Sarah Martinez, the lead flight attendant, had worked for the airline for 12 years and had developed a professional smile that could survive even the most demanding passengers. But something about Blake's entitled attitude made her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had seen his type before: wealthy men who treated airline staff like personal servants and measured their own importance by how much inconvenience they could cause for others. Still, she maintained her professional composure, adjusting Blake's seat preferences and bringing him the specific brand of sparkling water he demanded, all while mentally preparing herself for what promised to be a long flight. Elijah boarded several minutes later, walking down the jet bridge with his worn leather medical bag slung over his shoulder and his boarding pass in hand. He nodded politely to Sarah as he passed through the first-class cabin, and she immediately noticed the difference in his demeanor. Where Blake had been demanding and condescending, Elijah was courteous and respectful, thanking her for her assistance and apologizing for the minor inconvenience of stowing his medical bag in the overhead compartment. As Elijah approached row 2, Blake looked up from his Financial Times with the expression of a homeowner discovering a trespasser in his backyard. His eyes swept over Elijah's appearance, taking in the simple charcoal blazer, the comfortable walking shoes, and the absence of obvious wealth markers that Blake used to categorize people. In Blake's mental taxonomy, Elijah didn't belong in first class, and Blake had never been shy about pointing out when people seemed to be in places where they didn't fit. The moment Elijah checked his boarding pass and confirmed that he was indeed assigned to seat 2B directly next to Blake's carefully claimed territory, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted from routine pre-flight preparation to something more charged and unpredictable. Blake's face hardened into an expression that his business rivals would have recognized as the look he wore when he was preparing to destroy someone's career, and Elijah sensed immediately that his simple presence had somehow become a problem for his seatmate. Sarah watched this silent confrontation develop with growing concern, her years of experience telling her that the next few minutes would determine whether Flight 847 departed on schedule or became another incident report in her supervisor's files. She had seen enough conflicts between passengers to recognize the warning signs, and something about the way Blake was staring at Elijah made her quietly signal to Helen Rodriguez, the purser, that they might need additional support in the first-class cabin. Neither Blake nor Elijah spoke during those initial moments, but the tension between them was palpable, a pressure that seemed to affect even the other first-class passengers, who began glancing nervously in their direction. Blake was calculating his options, determining how to reclaim control of a situation that had already moved beyond his comfort zone, while Elijah was simply trying to understand why his presence seemed to have caused such an immediate and intense reaction from a complete stranger. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both their lives forever, though neither man could have imagined how dramatically the next hour would reshape their understanding of power privilege and the true cost of hatred. In a few minutes, Blake would say words that could never be taken back, and Elijah would respond with a dignity that would expose the vast difference between being wealthy and being wise. "Excuse me, I think you might be in the wrong section," Blake said, not bothering to look up from his newspaper as Elijah stood in the aisle checking his boarding pass. The words were delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to correcting other people's mistakes, and Blake's tone suggested that he was doing Elijah a favor by pointing out what was obviously an error that would embarrass them both if it weren't addressed immediately. Elijah paused and double-checked his boarding pass, confirming what he already knew. Seat 2B, first-class window seat. He looked at Blake, who was sprawled across both armrests, with his legs stretched into the aisle, creating a physical barrier that would require Blake to move in order for Elijah to reach his assigned seat. "I have seat 2B," Elijah said politely, holding up his boarding pass so Blake could see the clearly printed seat assignment. Blake's eyes flicked over the boarding pass with the skeptical expression of someone examining a document he suspected might be forged. "Check your ticket again," he said, his voice carrying the edge of impatience that came from a lifetime of having his suggestions treated as commands. "Economy is way back there past the curtain. Easy mistake to make if you're not familiar with how these things work." The assumption underlying Blake's words was so casual and confident that several nearby passengers turned to watch the interaction, sensing that something significant was developing, but not yet understanding the full scope of what they were witnessing. Blake had made his assessment of Elijah based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the absence of obvious wealth markers, and he was now doubling down on that assessment with the unwavering certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything important in his life. Elijah felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced as a child when teachers assumed he wasn't smart enough for advanced classes, when store clerks followed him through departments where he had every right to shop, when patients' families expressed surprise that their surgeon was a young black man from Detroit. But 48 years of living had taught him to respond to ignorance with patience rather than anger, to educate rather than retaliate, and to maintain his dignity, even when others seemed determined to strip it away. "I'm quite familiar with how airline seating works," Elijah replied, his voice remaining steady despite the insult that had been delivered so casually it might have been mistaken for helpful advice. "This is my seat. If you could just move your legs slightly, I'll be out of your way in just a moment." Blake looked at Elijah, as if he had just spoken in a foreign language, his expression shifting from casual dismissal to active irritation. In Blake's world, people didn't politely disagree with him. They either accepted his judgment immediately or faced increasingly severe consequences until they learned to comply. The fact that Elijah was calmly standing his ground despite Blake's clear indication that he didn't belong in first class was both confusing and infuriating to a man who measured his success by his ability to control every interaction. "I'm not moving my legs," Blake said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the passengers in nearby rows. "And I'm not sitting next to someone who doesn't understand basic travel etiquette. There's clearly been some kind of computer error or upgrade mistake, and we need to get this sorted out before we waste any more time." Sarah Martinez appeared at Blake's elbow with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with difficult passengers many times before, but she could already sense that this interaction was different from the typical first-class complaints about seat assignments or meal preferences. The body language between the two men suggested that this was about something deeper than logistics, and Sarah's training had taught her to recognize the early warning signs of conflicts that could escalate beyond the crew's ability to manage. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the professional cheerfulness that airline personnel use to diffuse tension while gathering information about potential security threats. She had positioned herself so that she could see both men's faces and hands, and she was already mentally reviewing the protocols for removing disruptive passengers from the aircraft. "Yes, there's definitely a problem," Blake said, turning his attention to Sarah with relief that someone in authority had finally arrived to resolve what he considered an obvious administrative error. "I paid $12,000 for this seat, and I specifically requested a certain type of travel experience. This gentleman seems to have been given incorrect information about his seat assignment, and I'd like to get him relocated to the appropriate section before we take off." Sarah looked at Elijah's boarding pass, scanned the barcode with her handheld device, and confirmed what was already clear from the printed ticket. "Dr. Washington, welcome aboard," she said, emphasizing Elijah's title in a way that made Blake's eyebrows raise slightly. "You are indeed assigned to Seat 2B. Let me help you get settled." The word doctor hung in the air like a challenge to Blake's assumptions, but instead of backing down or acknowledging his error, Blake doubled down on his original position with the stubborn certainty of someone who had never been forced to admit he was wrong about anything. "I don't care what the computer says." Blake said, his face beginning to flush with the mottled red color that his business associates would have recognized as a warning sign of an impending explosion. "I paid for comfort. I paid for exclusivity. And I paid for a certain type of environment. This is not what I paid for." Elijah watched Blake's escalating agitation with the clinical detachment of someone trained to assess patients under stress, and he recognized the signs of a man whose sense of control was being threatened by circumstances beyond his ability to manipulate. "Sir," Elijah said quietly, "I understand you're concerned about your comfort, but I'm simply trying to take my assigned seat so we can both get to London. I'm not looking for any trouble, and I'll be happy to keep to myself during the flight." "You'll keep to yourself?" Blake repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm that made several passengers cringe with second-hand embarrassment. "That's very generous of you. But here's the thing I don't want you to keep to yourself. I want you to keep to yourself somewhere else, somewhere more appropriate for someone of your background." The word background carried enough loaded meaning to make Sarah take a step back, her professional composure beginning to crack as she realized that this wasn't a simple seat assignment dispute, but something much more serious and potentially dangerous. She had been trained to handle drunk passengers, anxious flyers, and even medical emergencies. But dealing with overt racism required a different set of skills and a different level of backup support. Blake leaned forward in his seat, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "Look, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but I need you to understand something very clearly. I am not the kind of person who compromises on matters of personal comfort and safety. I've worked too hard and paid too much to spend the next 8 hours sitting next to someone I don't want to sit next to. So either you find another seat, or we're going to have a much bigger problem." Elijah looked into Blake's eyes and saw something that went beyond simple prejudice or ignorance. He saw the cold calculation of someone who had spent his entire life using power and intimidation to get his way. Someone who viewed other human beings as obstacles to be moved or problems to be solved, rather than individuals deserving of basic respect and dignity. In that moment, Elijah understood that no amount of politeness or reasonableness would change Blake's mind, because Blake's hostility wasn't based on anything Elijah had done or said. It was based on who Elijah was, something that couldn't be negotiated or compromised away. "I see," Elijah said softly, and those two words carried more weight than Blake could possibly understand. They carried the weight of every brilliant student who had been underestimated, every qualified professional who had been overlooked, every human being who had been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. But they also carried something else. The quiet strength of someone who had faced prejudice before and had learned that the best response to hatred is not more hatred, but the unwavering insistence on being treated with the dignity that every human being deserves. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Blake announced to Sarah, his voice carrying across the first-class cabin with the authority of someone accustomed to having his demands treated as emergencies. "This is completely unacceptable, and I need someone with actual authority to resolve this situation before it gets any more out of hand than it already has." Sarah nodded professionally and moved toward the front of the cabin to summon Helen Rodriguez, the purser, but she kept one eye on Blake and Elijah, sensing that the tension between them was building towards something that could explode without warning. In her 12 years with the airline, she had seen conflicts escalate from simple disagreements to federal violations in a matter of minutes, and something about Blake's aggressive posture and Elijah's careful stillness made her worry that this situation was headed in a dangerous direction. Other first-class passengers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. The tech mogul in seat 1F had his phone discreetly positioned to record whatever happened next, while the elderly woman in seat 3A was whispering urgently to her traveling companion about whether they should request a seat change to avoid whatever unpleasantness was clearly brewing in row 2. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from pre-flight anticipation to the kind of charged uncertainty that preceded either violence or viral video moments. Helen Rodriguez appeared within minutes, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who had been flying for 25 years and had developed the no-nonsense demeanor necessary to maintain order at 30,000 feet. She took one look at Blake's flushed face and Elijah's carefully controlled composure, and immediately understood that this wasn't a routine passenger complaint, but a situation that could potentially ground the flight if it wasn't handled with perfect precision. "What seems to be the issue here, gentlemen?" Helen asked, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had diffused countless conflicts over the years, but was prepared to escalate to whatever level of response the situation required. Blake straightened in his seat with the confidence of someone finally speaking to a person who would understand his perspective and take appropriate action. "The issue is very simple," he said, gesturing toward Elijah with the casual dismissiveness he might use when pointing out a stain on his shirt. "I specifically requested a suitable travel environment when I booked this flight, and this is not what I paid for. I need this gentleman relocated to an appropriate section so that I can have the flight experience I purchased." Helen looked at Elijah's boarding pass, confirmed his seat assignment, and then looked back at Blake with an expression that gave away nothing about her thoughts, but suggested she was rapidly running through various protocols for dealing with disruptive passengers. "Dr. Washington has a valid first-class ticket, sir," she said evenly. "His seat assignment is correct, and he has every right to be exactly where he is." Rights. Blake laughed, a harsh sound that made several passengers physically recoil. "Let me tell you something about rights. I have the right to a comfortable flight which I paid for in advance. I have the right to a certain standard of service which was promised to me when I purchased this ticket. And I have the right to express my safety concerns about sitting next to someone I don't know, someone who makes me uncomfortable, someone who quite frankly doesn't belong in this section." The word belong carried enough venom to make Helen's professional mask slip slightly, and she exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah that communicated volumes about what they both suspected was really driving Blake's objections. Neither of them was naive enough to miss the racial undertones of his complaints, but they needed Blake to say something explicitly discriminatory before they could take the kind of decisive action that this situation was beginning to demand. Elijah had remained silent during this exchange, partly because his medical training had taught him the value of observing before acting, and partly because he recognized that Blake was digging himself into a hole that would soon become impossible to escape. Sometimes the best response to ignorance was simply to give it enough rope to hang itself, and Elijah sensed that Blake was rapidly approaching a moment when his true character would be revealed for everyone to see. Sir Helen said to Blake, her voice taking on the edge that frequent flyers would recognize as the final warning before serious consequences. "I need you to be very specific about what you mean when you say Dr. Washington doesn't belong in first class. Are you suggesting that there's something about his appearance or behavior that makes him unsuitable to fly in this section?" Blake looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of passengers and crew members all focused on him, all waiting for his response to a question that had no good answer if he told the truth and no believable answer if he lied. He was trapped between his genuine beliefs and the social expectations of polite society, and the combination of alcohol stress and a lifetime of unchecked privilege pushed him toward a choice that would destroy everything he had spent decades building. "Fine," Blake said, his voice rising to a level that could be heard throughout the aircraft. "You want me to be specific? I'll be specific. I specifically requested a suitable environment, and sitting next to him is not suitable. I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable, and quite frankly, I don't trust him. I've worked too hard to get where I am to spend 8 hours worrying about who I'm sitting next to." Helen felt her heart rate increase as she recognized that Blake was teetering on the edge of saying something that would cross legal lines and require immediate intervention from law enforcement. "Sir, what specifically about Dr. Washington makes you feel unsafe? Has he said something threatening? Has he behaved aggressively?" "It's not about what he said," Blake replied, his voice now carrying across the cabin with the clarity of someone who had abandoned all pretense of subtlety or political correctness. "It's about what he is. It's about the fact that people like him don't belong in places like this, and I shouldn't have to explain that to anyone with half a brain." The silence that followed Blake's words was absolute and terrible, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the cabin and leave everyone struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Elijah closed his eyes for just a moment, feeling the familiar weight of prejudice settle over him like a heavy coat. But when he opened them again, his expression was calm and somehow sad, as if he were looking at a patient with a terminal diagnosis that could have been prevented with better choices. "I see." Elijah said again those same 2 words that had carried so much meaning earlier, but now they carried something additional, a profound disappointment in the capacity of human beings to choose hatred over understanding, fear over compassion, and division over the simple recognition that we all share the same fundamental humanity. Blake, emboldened by what he interpreted as Elijah's passive acceptance of his position, leaned forward and delivered the words that would end his career, destroy his reputation, and haunt him for the rest of his life. "The bottom line is this. I don't fly with black people. I don't trust them. I don't like them, and I certainly don't sit shoulder to shoulder with them while I sleep. That's just how it is, and if you have a problem with that, then we need to find a solution that works for me." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow, and the reaction was immediate and visceral. Passengers gasped audibly. Phones appeared to record what was happening, and the crew members exchanged glances that communicated their shared understanding that they were now dealing with a federal hate crime in progress. Blake had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would have consequences far beyond the confines of Flight 847. Elijah looked at Blake for a long moment, seeing not a monster, but a broken human being whose fear and hatred had consumed whatever capacity for decency he might once have possessed. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Whitmore, that is a very unfortunate condition you have. I hope someday you'll seek treatment for it." Helen Rodriguez had heard enough. In 25 years of flying, she had dealt with drunk passengers, belligerent celebrities, and even a few individuals who had made inappropriate comments about race or religion. But she had never encountered someone who openly declared their refusal to fly with passengers based solely on the color of their skin. Blake's words constituted a clear violation of federal aviation regulations, and more importantly, they had created a hostile environment that could compromise the safety of everyone on board. "Mr. Whitmore," Helen said, her voice now carrying the full authority of someone who was no longer trying to manage a difficult customer, but was instead enforcing federal law. "What you just said constitutes discriminatory behavior under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and federal aviation safety regulations. I am going to contact the captain immediately, and I strongly suggest you use the next few minutes to reconsider your position." Blake laughed again, the same harsh sound that had made passengers cringe earlier, but now it carried an additional note of disbelief that anyone would dare to threaten him with consequences for simply expressing his personal preferences. "You think you can intimidate me with legal jargon," he said, standing up so that he towered over Helen and Sarah, using his physical size to project dominance in a situation where he was rapidly losing control. "I'm Blake Whitmore. I own half of Manhattan. I know the CEO of this airline personally, and I guarantee you that by tomorrow morning both of you will be looking for new jobs if you don't resolve this situation in my favor right now." Helen didn't respond to Blake's threats. Instead, she pressed the call button that connected her directly to the cockpit and spoke in the calm, professional tone that pilots and flight attendants use to communicate during emergencies. "Captain Torres, we have a Code Charlie situation in first class. Passenger in 2A has made explicit discriminatory statements and is refusing to comply with crew instructions. Request your immediate assistance." In the cockpit, Captain David Torres heard Helen's report with the grim recognition of someone who had been flying long enough to know that some situations required swift, decisive action to prevent escalation into something much more dangerous. At 55, Captain Torres had flown F-16S in the Air Force before transitioning to commercial aviation, and he had learned that effective leadership meant making difficult decisions quickly and standing behind them regardless of the personal cost. Captain Torres was a man who had built his career on precision integrity and an absolute commitment to the safety and dignity of every person who stepped aboard his aircraft. He had grown up in San Antonio as the son of immigrants who had taught him that respect for others wasn't a luxury or a political position, but a fundamental requirement for living in a civilized society. His father had been a mechanic who worked on the planes that David now piloted, and he had never forgotten the pride in his father's voice when David had earned his wings and his captain's stripes. When Helen's call came through, Captain Torres was completing the final pre-flight checks with his first officer, but he immediately understood that the technical aspects of preparing for takeoff were now secondary to addressing a situation that could compromise the safety and security of everyone on board. He had dealt with disruptive passengers before, but discriminatory behavior was something that crossed lines that he would never tolerate on his aircraft. "Take over the pre-flight," Captain Torres told his first officer as he removed his headset and reached for his hat. "I need to address a passenger issue, and depending on how this goes, we may need to return to the gate." Captain Torres walked through the cockpit door and into the first-class cabin with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, his 4 gold stripes catching the overhead lights, and his expression conveying the kind of calm authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The cabin fell silent as passengers recognized that the captain's personal involvement meant this situation had escalated beyond routine passenger management into something much more serious. Blake turned to face Captain Torres with relief and confidence, assuming that the arrival of the highest-ranking crew member meant that his complaints would finally be addressed by someone with the authority to implement the solution he had been demanding. Captain Blake said, extending his hand for a handshake that Captain Torres did not return. "I'm glad you're here. Your staff has been completely incompetent in handling what should be a simple passenger relocation issue." Captain Torres looked at Blake, then at Elijah, then back at Blake, his expression revealing nothing about his thoughts, but somehow managing to convey that he had already formed opinions about both men based on their posture, their demeanor, and the way they had conducted themselves during what was clearly a significant conflict. "I understand you've been expressing concerns about your seating arrangement, mister." Whitmore Captain Torres said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stop talking and start listening. "Exactly," Blake replied, interpreting the captain's neutral tone as an invitation to present his case to someone who would finally understand his position. "I paid $12,000 for a first-class experience, and I specifically requested a suitable travel environment. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that my preferences be accommodated, especially given my status as a premium passenger and my history with this airline." Captain Torres listened to Blake's explanation without interruption, but his eyes never left Blake's face, and passengers who were watching closely would have noticed that the captain's expression grew colder and more distant with every word Blake spoke. When Blake finished his justification, Captain Torres allowed several seconds of silence to pass before responding, a technique he had learned in military leadership training that often revealed more about a person's character than any direct questioning could accomplish. "Mr. Whitmore," Captain Torres said finally, "I've been informed that you made specific statements about Dr. Washington based on his race. I need you to confirm whether that information is accurate." Blake's face flushed again as he realized that the captain was not going to automatically side with him based on his status as a premium passenger, but he had already committed himself to a position that he couldn't abandon without losing face completely. "I expressed my personal safety concerns about my seating assignment," Blake said, choosing his words more carefully but refusing to back down from the essential point of his objections. "I have the right to feel comfortable and secure during my flight, and I don't feel comfortable sitting next to someone who doesn't belong in this section." Captain Torres nodded slowly, as if Blake had just confirmed something he had already suspected. "And when you say Dr. Washington doesn't belong in this section, you're basing that assessment on what specific factors?" The question was a trap, and Blake was smart enough to recognize it, but his pride and his lifetime of unchallenged privilege made it impossible for him to simply apologize and move on. "I'm basing it on my personal judgment and my right to choose my travel companions," Blake said, his voice taking on the defensive edge of someone who knew he was losing an argument but couldn't figure out how to retreat gracefully. "Your personal judgment," Captain Torres repeated, and something in his tone made Blake realize that he was no longer speaking to someone who might be sympathetic to his position. "And that personal judgment is based on Dr. Washington's race. Is that correct?" Blake looked around the cabin, seeing the faces of passengers and crew members, all focused on him, all waiting for his answer to a question that would define him for the rest of his life. He could have apologized, could have claimed he was stressed or misunderstood, could have found some way to back away from the cliff edge he was approaching. Instead, he chose to jump. "Yes," Blake said, the single word carrying the weight of everything he had built and everything he was about to lose. "That's correct. I don't fly with black people, and I don't think I should have to explain or justify that preference to anyone." Captain Torres looked at Blake for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, and in those seconds, Blake saw something shift in the captain's expression that made him realize he had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. When Captain Torres finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the kind of finality that comes with irreversible decisions. "Mr. Whitmore," Captain Torres said, reaching up to remove his captain's hat on my aircraft, "the only thing that matters is respect. Respect for the safety of the flight, respect for my crew, and respect for every soul on board. You have violated all 3 principles." Blake watched in confusion as Captain Torres tucked his hat under his arm and stepped toward the cockpit to retrieve his flight bag. Not understanding what was happening, but beginning to sense that the captain's actions represented something much more serious than a simple passenger discipline issue. "I am the pilot in command of this aircraft," Captain Torres announced, his voice now carrying clearly throughout the cabin, "and as pilot in command, I have the authority to determine whether conditions are safe for flight. The hostile environment you have created makes this flight unsafe to operate. Since you refuse to treat Dr. Washington with basic human dignity, I refuse to fly this aircraft." The words hit Blake like a physical blow as he realized that the captain was not going to remove Elijah from the flight. He was removing himself, effectively grounding the aircraft and stranding all 180 passengers because of Blake's refusal to share a row with a black doctor. The power dynamic that Blake had assumed would work in his favor had completely reversed, and he was no longer the customer whose preferences mattered, but the problem that needed to be solved. "You can't do that," Blake said, his voice rising in panic as the full implications of the captain's decision became clear. "You have a contract, you have a schedule, you have passengers depending on you. You can't just walk away because of one difficult passenger. Captain Torres looked at Blake one final time, and his expression contained no anger, no hatred, no personal animosity, just the calm determination of someone who had made a decision based on principles that were more important than profit, more valuable than convenience, and more essential than any individual passenger's comfort. "Watch me," Captain Torres said simply. And with that, he walked past Blake, past the rows of stunned first-class passengers, and off the aircraft, leaving behind an empty cockpit, a grounded flight, and a silence that would soon be filled with applause, viral videos, and the sound of Blake Whitmore's carefully constructed world falling apart. The silence that followed Captain Torres's exit lasted exactly 7 seconds before the sound of clapping began in the back of economy class, started by a passenger who had overheard the entire confrontation through the thin cabin walls. The applause rippled forward through the aircraft like a wave gaining strength and volume as it moved through premium economy and finally broke over the first-class cabin, where Blake stood frozen in the aisle, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and dawning horror. The clapping wasn't polite or restrained. It was thunderous, sustained, and filled with the kind of righteous approval that comes when people witness someone taking a principled stand, regardless of the personal cost. Passengers were standing now, some wiping tears from their eyes, others holding up their phones to capture Blake's reaction to the overwhelming judgment of his peers. The elderly woman in seat 3A was clapping so enthusiastically that her jewelry rattled, and even the typically reserved tech mogul in 1F had set aside his usual cynicism to join the demonstration of support for Captain Torres's decision. Blake spun around in the aisle, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words that could somehow regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his ability to manage. "Stop it!" He finally managed to shout over the applause, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to project authority while his entire worldview crumbled around him. "This is insane. You're all losing your minds over nothing. This is just business, just preference, just common sense." But the clapping continued, and Blake could see in the faces surrounding him that he had become something he had never been before in his privileged life, the villain in a story where everyone else was rooting for his downfall. The tech mogul's phone was still recording, capturing every moment of Blake's meltdown for an audience that would soon number in the millions, and Blake's attempts to justify his position were only making him look more unhinged and desperate. Sarah Martinez was speaking urgently into her headset, coordinating with ground control and airport security to manage what was quickly becoming a complex logistical nightmare. A commercial aircraft couldn't sit at the gate indefinitely with passengers on board, and Captain Torres's departure had created a situation that required immediate resolution. Within minutes, she received confirmation that Port Authority police were en route and that the airline's crisis management team was scrambling to find a replacement crew for what was supposed to be a routine transatlantic flight. Elijah remained seated throughout the chaos, his medical bag still in his lap, his expression calm despite the swirling emotions and raised voices around him. He had witnessed enough human drama in hospital emergency rooms to recognize that Blake was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown, and his training had taught him to observe rather than intervene when someone was destroying themselves more effectively than any outside force could manage. The first officer, Timothy Chen, appeared in the doorway of the cockpit with the shell-shocked expression of someone whose routine evening had just become a career-defining moment. He picked up the intercom microphone with hands that shook slightly, knowing that his next words would be recorded, analyzed, and probably replayed on news programs around the world. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Chen speaking." His voice echoed through the cabin, cutting through the applause which gradually died down to allow passengers to hear the official announcement. "As you have witnessed, Captain Torres has removed himself from duty. Under federal aviation regulations, this aircraft cannot operate without a pilot in command. Flight 847 to London is therefore canceled until further notice." The groan that went up from the passengers was directed not at the crew or the airline, but at Blake, whose selfish behavior had cost 179 innocent people their travel plans, their connections, their business meetings, and their family reunions. Blake found himself at the center of a circle of hostile stares and angry whispers, and for the first time in his adult life, he was completely powerless to change his circumstances through money threats or intimidation. "You see what you've done," Blake shouted at Elijah, pointing an accusatory finger that shook with rage and desperation. "You've destroyed this flight, stranded all these people, caused all this chaos. This is your fault for not just taking a different seat when I asked politely." Elijah looked at Blake with an expression that mixed pity with professional concern, the way a doctor might look at a patient whose condition was worse than they understood. "Mr. Whitmore," Elijah said quietly, "I haven't done anything except exist in a space where you believe I don't belong. The only person responsible for this situation is you." Blake's face turned an alarming shade of purple as the truth of Elijah's words penetrated his defensive rationalization, and several passengers actually stepped back, worried that he might become physically violent. But before Blake could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the jet bridge as 3 Port Authority police officers boarded the aircraft, led by Sergeant Maria Santos, a 20-year veteran whose expression suggested she had seen every kind of human stupidity the airport had to offer. Sergeant Santos surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who could assess a situation in seconds and determine the most efficient way to restore order. She saw Blake's disheveled appearance and aggressive posture, Elijah's calm dignity, despite being at the center of whatever had occurred, and the way the other passengers were all focused on Blake with expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility. "Who's the problem?" Sergeant Santos asked Helen Rodriguez, though her tone suggested she had already formed her own opinion based on the obvious dynamics in the cabin. Helen didn't hesitate. Mr. Whitmore in seat 2, made discriminatory statements, refused crew instructions, and created the hostile environment that forced our captain to remove himself from duty. Blake pushed forward, his voice rising to a pitch that suggested complete panic. "Officer, I am the victim here. I was simply expressing my safety concerns, and this man," he gestured wildly at Elijah, "has somehow turned everyone against me. I have rights, I have influence, and I demand that you restore order to this situation immediately." Sergeant Santos looked at Blake with the flat, unimpressed stare that cops reserved for people who thought their wealth or status would protect them from the consequences of their actions. "Sir, based on what I've been told and what I can observe, you've violated federal civil rights laws and interfered with the operation of a commercial aircraft. You need to gather your belongings and come with us for questioning." "I refuse," Blake said, crossing his arms and planting his feet as if he could somehow resist arrest through sheer force of will. "I haven't broken any laws. I expressed personal preferences about my travel arrangements, which is my right as a paying customer. I'm not going anywhere until someone with actual authority resolves this situation properly." Sergeant Santos had dealt with entitled passengers before, but something about Blake's complete disconnect from reality made her wonder if he was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. "Sir, you have 2 choices," she said, her voice carrying the patient firmness of someone who was prepared to use whatever level of force the situation required. "You can walk off this aircraft voluntarily, or we can carry you off in handcuffs. Either way, you're coming with us." Blake looked around the cabin one final time, seeing the faces of people who had witnessed his complete moral collapse and were now watching the consequences play out with the satisfaction of an audience seeing justice served. He realized that his money, his connections, and his carefully cultivated image were worthless in this moment, that he had burned every bridge and destroyed every relationship that might have protected him from the full weight of his own actions. As the officers escorted him toward the exit, Blake stopped next to Elijah's seat and leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more venom than his earlier shouting had managed. "You think you've won something here?" Blake hissed. "But I have resources you can't imagine. I'm going to find out exactly who you are, where you work, and how to destroy your life. By Monday morning, you'll wish you had just taken a different seat when I asked nicely." Elijah looked up at Blake with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced threats before and had learned that the best response to hatred was simply to refuse to be diminished by it. "Safe travels, Mr. Whitmore," Elijah said, and those 3 words contained more dignity than all of Blake's wealth and bluster combined. They also contained something else that Blake was too angry to recognize in that moment: forgiveness for a broken man who had destroyed his own life through choices that could never be undone. As Blake was led off the aircraft to face consequences he had never imagined possible, the passengers erupted in another round of applause, this time celebrating not just Captain Torres's principled stand, but also Elijah's grace under pressure, and the simple truth that sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is the refusal to hate in return. The video appeared on social media exactly 97 minutes after Blake Whitmore was escorted off Flight 847, uploaded by the tech mogul in Seat 1F, with a caption that would be shared, retweeted, and reposted millions of times over the next 24 hours. "Racist passenger says he won't fly with black people. Pilot walks off plane like an absolute legend." This is what standing up for what's right looks like. The footage was crystal clear, shot in high definition on a phone that captured every detail of Blake's red, sweating face as he declared his refusal to fly with black passengers, every moment of Captain Torres removing his hat and walking away, and every second of Blake's increasingly desperate attempts to justify his position as the situation spiraled beyond his control. The audio was perfect, picking up not just Blake's discriminatory statements, but also his threats about destroying careers and his complete inability to understand why anyone would dare to challenge his demands. Within the first hour, the video had been viewed 2 million times. Within the second hour, it had been picked up by major news outlets and was trending on every social media platform under hashtags like #FlightFromHell, #PilotHero, and #BlakeWhitmoreIsRacist. By the third hour, enterprising internet users had identified Blake from his distinctive platinum blonde hair and expensive suit, and his full name, company information, and business background were being shared across platforms faster than any damage control team could possibly contain. Blake, meanwhile, was sitting in an airport police station processing room, still convinced that his wealth and connections would protect him from any serious consequences. He had been issued a federal citation for interference with flight crew operations and disorderly conduct charges that could result in substantial fines and up to a year in federal prison. But Blake's attention was focused on the expensive lawyer who was driving to JFK to handle what Blake still believed was a minor public relations problem that could be managed with the right spin and sufficient financial pressure. Jonathan Sterling, Blake's attorney, arrived at the airport with the grim expression of someone who had already seen the viral video and understood that his client had created a legal and public relations nightmare that would be impossible to manage through traditional damage control methods. Jonathan was a skilled crisis management lawyer who had helped wealthy clients navigate scandals involving everything from tax evasion to sexual harassment. But Blake's explicit racism had been captured in such clear detail that there was no plausible way to claim misunderstanding or misrepresentation. Blake Jonathan said as they sat in a small conference room adjacent to the police station. "I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. The video of your behavior has gone viral, and it's not some grainy security footage that we can dispute. It's high-definition evidence of you making explicitly discriminatory statements and threatening airline personnel. This isn't a misunderstanding that we can spin. This is a federal hate crime that was witnessed by 180 people and recorded for posterity." Blake waved dismissively, still operating under the assumption that legal problems were just expensive inconveniences that could be resolved with sufficient financial resources. "Just handle it, Jonathan. File motions, claim emotional distress, challenge the validity of the recording, whatever you need to do. I'll pay whatever it costs to make this go away quickly and quietly." Jonathan stared at his client with the expression of someone trying to explain complex surgery to a patient who insisted that a Band-Aid would be sufficient treatment. "Blake, you can't make viral videos disappear. The footage has been downloaded, copied, and saved by millions of people. Major news networks are already running segments about racial discrimination in air travel, and they're using your face as the poster child for everything that's wrong with entitled privilege. This isn't going away, and it's not going to be quiet." As if to emphasize Jonathan's point, Blake's phone, which had been buzzing intermittently throughout their conversation, suddenly erupted in a continuous stream of notifications that made the device vibrate across the table like an angry insect. Blake picked it up and scrolled through dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and an email inbox that was updating so rapidly the numbers blurred together in a digital avalanche of consequences. The first call Blake returned was to his wife, Catherine, who was at their Hamptons estate preparing for a charity gala that would now have to be canceled due to the scandal her husband had created. Catherine answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the cold fury of someone whose carefully constructed social life had just been destroyed by her husband's public humiliation. "Blake," Catherine said without preamble, "I've already spoken to my attorney. The divorce papers will be filed tomorrow morning, and I'm invoking the morality clause in our prenuptial agreement. The video of your racist tirade is sufficient grounds to void any claims you might have to marital assets, and I'll be seeking a restraining order to prevent you from coming near any of our properties until this matter is resolved." Blake felt the first flutter of genuine panic as he realized that the consequences of his actions were extending far beyond the inconvenience of a canceled flight. "Catherine, you can't be serious. This is just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. I never intended for any of this to happen, and once the lawyers clean up the legal issues, everything will go back to normal." "Normal?" Catherine's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Blake, I've watched that video 17 times, and each viewing made me more ashamed that I've spent 20 years married to someone capable of that kind of hatred. You didn't slip up or make a mistake, you revealed exactly who you are, and I can't be married to that person for another day." The call ended with the brutal finality of a door slamming, and Blake immediately dialed the direct number for Roger Henderson, the chairman of Whitmore Holdings' board of directors and the man who had the power to stabilize Blake's business empire while the personal scandal played out in the media. Roger's assistant answered and immediately put Blake through a courtesy that Blake interpreted as a sign that his professional relationships remained intact despite the viral video. Blake Roger said, his voice carrying none of the warmth or familiarity that had characterized their previous conversations. "I assume you're calling about the video that's currently destroying our company's reputation and stock price." Blake tried to project confidence despite the growing evidence that his world was collapsing around him. "Roger, I know this looks bad, but we can weather this storm if we handle it correctly. Issue a statement saying I was under medical stress, maybe claim the video was edited or taken out of context. The important thing is that we don't let a personal incident interfere with business operations, especially with the London acquisition so close to completion." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Blake began to wonder if the call had been disconnected, but when Roger finally spoke, his words carried the finality of a judge reading a death sentence. "Blake, the London deal is dead." Our British partners watched the video and immediately terminated all negotiations. They released a public statement saying they don't do business with organizations that tolerate racial discrimination, and they specifically mentioned that they were horrified by your behavior. Blake's hand began to shake as he held the phone, the first physical manifestation of the stress that was beginning to overwhelm his nervous system. "That's impossible. The deal has been in negotiation for 3 years. We have binding letters of intent, we have financing in place, we have everything we need to close tomorrow morning. We had everything Roger corrected. Past tense." The British consortium released a statement 2 hours ago saying they were withdrawing from all discussions with Whitmore Holdings due to fundamental differences in corporate values. They specifically mentioned that they couldn't associate their brand with someone who expressed such explicit racial prejudice in such a public forum. Blake dropped into a chair, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight as the implications of Roger's words penetrated his shock and disbelief. The London deal wasn't just another real estate transaction. It was the cornerstone of Blake's 5-year business plan, the acquisition that would establish his company as a major player in international markets and generate enough revenue to fund a dozen smaller deals over the next decade. "Who are these people to judge me?" Blake asked, his voice rising in desperation. "They don't know me. They don't understand the context. They don't have any right to destroy years of careful business negotiations based on one incident that has nothing to do with my professional capabilities." Roger's response was delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that Blake would have recognized if he hadn't been too panicked to think clearly. "Blake, I've called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. We'll be voting on your removal as CEO and the restructuring of the company under new leadership. Your behavior has created liability issues that we can't accept, and your racist statements have damaged our brand in ways that will take years to repair." The call ended without goodbyes or expressions of regret, leaving Blake staring at his phone in the fluorescent-lit conference room, while Jonathan watched his client's face cycle through the stages of grief that always accompanied the sudden loss of everything a person had spent their lifetime building. Blake had entered the airport that morning as one of the most powerful real estate developers in Manhattan, and he was leaving it as an unemployed pariah whose name would become synonymous with exactly the kind of entitled racism that enlightened society had supposedly moved beyond. But Blake's ordeal was just beginning, and the worst revelation was still to come, the discovery that would transform his humiliation from a public relations disaster into a cosmic joke that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The private investigator Blake hired to research Dr. Elijah Washington's background was a former NYPD detective named Marcus Chen, who specialized in corporate intelligence gathering and had built a reputation for uncovering embarrassing secrets about Blake's business rivals and legal opponents. Blake's instructions had been simple. Find something, anything, that could be used to discredit the doctor who had caused the airline incident and destroy his career before he could capitalize on his sudden fame as the victim of Blake's racist outburst. Marcus was accustomed to clients who wanted dirt on their enemies, but something about Blake's frantic desperation and explicit instructions to destroy this guy's life completely made him uncomfortable with the assignment. Still, Blake was paying his premium rate plus a substantial bonus for expedited results, so Marcus began the kind of deep background research that had made him valuable to Manhattan's elite for more than a decade. What Marcus discovered in the first hour of research was so far from what Blake had expected that the investigator initially assumed he was looking at the wrong person. Dr. Elijah Washington wasn't some minor physician with a questionable reputation or hidden scandals waiting to be exposed. He was one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the world with a medical resume that read like a collection of humanitarian achievements and scientific breakthroughs that had revolutionized pediatric heart surgery. Marcus's initial search revealed that Dr. Washington had graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Medical School, completed his residency at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and founded the Washington Heart Institute, which provided free cardiac surgery to children from underserved communities around the globe. His research on congenital heart defects had been published in every major medical journal. He had been invited to lecture at medical conferences on 6 continents, and he had personally performed life-saving surgeries on more than 3,000 children whose families could never have afforded the cost of his expertise. But the more Marcus dug into Dr. Washington's background, the more uncomfortable he became with Blake's intention to use this information for destructive purposes. Elijah Washington wasn't just a successful doctor. He was a genuine humanitarian whose work had earned recognition from medical organizations, charitable foundations, and government agencies around the world. He had been awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor for his volunteer work in disaster zones, had been named one of Time magazine's most influential people in healthcare, and had received honorary degrees from universities that recognized his contributions to both medicine and social justice. Marcus's discomfort reached a breaking point when he discovered the most recent news about Dr. Washington. The surgeon was currently in London, performing an experimental procedure on an 8-year-old girl whose condition was so rare that only 3 similar cases had ever been documented in medical literature. The surgery was being broadcast live to medical schools around the world as an educational demonstration of techniques that could save other children with similar defects, and Dr. Washington was donating his time and expertise without compensation because the child's family had already exhausted their financial resources on previous treatments. When Marcus called Blake to deliver his report, he knew he was about to destroy whatever remained of his client's mental stability, but professional obligation required him to share what he had discovered. Blake answered the phone with the manic energy of someone who had been awake for 36 hours, sustained only by caffeine alcohol, and the desperate hope that his investigator had found ammunition for a counterattack against the man he blamed for his downfall. "Tell me you found something good," Blake said without preamble. "Tell me this guy has malpractice suits, tax problems, gambling debts, anything I can use to shift the narrative away from what happened on the plane." Marcus had delivered bad news to clients before, but he had never had to explain to someone that they had chosen to antagonize one of the most respected human beings on the planet. "Blake, I need you to sit down before I tell you what I found, because this information is going to be very difficult for you to process." Blake's voice rose in pitch as he sensed that Marcus's tone was all wrong for someone delivering useful intelligence. "Just tell me what you found. How bad can it be?" Marcus took a deep breath and began reading from his notes, knowing that each fact would hit Blake like a physical blow. Dr. Elijah Washington is arguably the most respected cardiac surgeon in the world. He saved more than 3,000 children's lives, founded a charity that provides free medical care to underserved communities, and is currently in London performing surgery on a child whose case is so complex that medical schools around the globe are watching the procedure as a teaching demonstration. Blake's silence lasted so long that Marcus wondered if the call had been dropped. But when Blake finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of someone processing information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. "That can't be right. Check again. He was just some random passenger who happened to be in first class. He can't be some kind of medical hero." Blake Marcus continued, his voice gentler now, as he recognized that his client was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown. "There's more. Dr. Washington didn't just happen to be in first class. He was upgraded by the hospital because they wanted their most valuable surgeon to arrive in London, rested for what might be the most important surgery of his career. The child he's operating on is the daughter of a British nobleman whose family has been trying to find someone capable of performing this procedure for 3 years. Blake dropped his phone, and it clattered across the floor of his Queen's apartment, the modest studio he had moved into after losing his penthouse, his Hamptons estate, and most of his liquid assets to divorce proceedings and legal settlements. He picked up the device with shaking hands, his mind racing as he tried to process the implications of what Marcus was telling him. "Are you saying," Blake asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I threatened to destroy the career of someone who saves children's lives for a living?" Marcus could hear the beginning of genuine emotional breakdown in Blake's voice, but he was obligated to complete his report regardless of the psychological impact on his client. "Blake, there's something else you need to know. Dr. Washington isn't just any cardiac surgeon. He's specifically known for treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, regardless of their background, and regardless of any personal characteristics that might cause other doctors to discriminate against them. He spent his entire career standing up for people who get treated exactly the way you treated him on that airplane." The cosmic irony of Blake's situation was so complete and devastating that he actually began to laugh a high-pitched sound that contained no humor but rather the desperate hysteria of someone whose mind was rejecting information that was too terrible to accept. Blake had chosen to antagonize not just any black passenger, but specifically the one person whose life's work represented everything Blake's behavior had violated: dignity, compassion, equality, and the fundamental belief that every human being deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of the color of their skin. But Marcus wasn't finished with his report, and the final piece of information he had uncovered would transform Blake's humiliation into something approaching divine justice. Blake Marcus said, his voice carrying the reluctant tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "There's one more thing you need to know about Dr. Washington, and it directly affects your business situation." Blake wiped tears from his eyes, unsure whether they were from laughter or grief or simple exhaustion. What else could there possibly be? How could this situation possibly get any worse? Marcus consulted his notes one final time before delivering the information that would complete Blake's understanding of exactly how completely he had destroyed his own life. The London property deal that you lost, the $800 million acquisition that was supposed to be the cornerstone of your international expansion, was being financed by a consortium of British investors led by the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Foundation. The foundation's chairman and primary decision-maker is Lord Emmanuel Washington, Dr. Elijah Washington's older brother, who has been funding his brother's humanitarian work for the past 15 years. Blake's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in the phone. When Blake finally spoke, his voice carried the flat, emotionless tone of someone whose capacity for processing shock had been completely overwhelmed. "You're telling me," Blake said slowly, "that I not only threatened the most respected surgeon in the world, but I also threatened the brother of the man who controls the financing for every major real estate deal in London." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Marcus confirmed. "Lord Washington released a public statement this morning saying that his foundation will never do business with individuals or organizations that promote racial discrimination, and he specifically mentioned that he was disgusted by your treatment of his brother." "Blake, you didn't just lose one deal, you've been blacklisted from every major real estate transaction in the United Kingdom for the foreseeable future." Blake set down the phone and walked to the single window of his studio apartment, looking out at a view of Queens that represented the furthest possible distance from the Manhattan penthouse where his journey had begun just 48 hours earlier. He had awakened that morning as one of the most powerful men in international real estate, and he was ending the day as a cautionary tale about the price of hatred, the cost of entitlement, and the terrible swift justice that sometimes visits people who believe their wealth makes them immune to the consequences of their actions. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of legal notifications, financial catastrophes, and social exile that left Blake reeling from the speed and scope of his complete downfall. What had begun as a canceled flight had metastasized into a comprehensive destruction of everything he had spent 30 years building, and each new consequence seemed to arrive with perfectly orchestrated timing to maximize the psychological impact on a man who had never experienced failure on any significant scale. The first domino fell at 9 a.m. sharp on Friday morning, when the board of directors of Whitmore Holdings convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to remove Blake as CEO, strip his name from the company, and restructure the organization under new leadership. The motion was passed in less than 15 minutes, with several board members citing their fiduciary duty to protect shareholders from the continuing damage that Blake's presence would cause to the company's reputation and business prospects. Roger Henderson, reading from a prepared statement that had been crafted by the company's crisis management team, announced that Whitmore Holdings would be renamed Vertex Capital Management, and that all existing contracts and business relationships would be reviewed to determine which could be salvaged and which had been irreparably damaged by association with Blake's racist behavior. The company's stock price had fallen 43% since the video went viral, wiping out nearly $2 billion in market capitalization and triggering a wave of lawsuits from shareholders who claimed that Blake's personal conduct had constituted gross negligence in his role as corporate fiduciary. Blake watched the board meeting via live stream from his lawyer's office, seeing his life's work dismantled with the clinical efficiency of surgeons removing a malignant tumor. The men and women he had worked with for decades spoke about him as if he were a stranger, whose association with the company had been an unfortunate historical accident that needed to be corrected as quickly as possible. Not one board member expressed personal regret about Blake's removal, and several made pointed comments about their relief that they could finally operate without the liability that his leadership had created. The second domino fell that afternoon when the Federal Aviation Administration announced that Blake was being placed on the national no-fly list, pending the outcome of his criminal trial, effectively banning him from commercial air travel for the foreseeable future. The FAA's statement, released through their press office, noted that Blake's behavior had endangered the safety of 179 passengers and violated federal regulations regarding interference with flight crews, and that his placement on the no-fly list was necessary to prevent similar incidents in the future. Jonathan Sterling Blake's attorney explained that challenging the no-fly designation would require years of litigation and had little chance of success given the video evidence of Blake's behavior and the federal nature of the charges he was facing. Blake Jonathan said, with the weary tone of someone who had delivered nothing but bad news for 3 consecutive days, "The government has an airtight case against you, and every day that video stays online makes it harder to argue that your placement on the no-fly list was anything other than appropriate." Blake stared out the window of Jonathan's Manhattan office, looking down at the streets where he had once wielded enormous influence, but where he was now essentially powerless to affect any aspect of his legal or financial situation. "How is this possible?" Blake asked, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose fundamental assumptions about how the world worked had been proven completely wrong. How can one conversation, one moment of poor judgment, destroy an entire lifetime of achievement? Jonathan had been practicing crisis management law for 25 years, but Blake's case was unique in his experience for the speed and completeness of the consequences that had followed from a single incident. Blake, this wasn't poor judgment. This was explicit racial discrimination captured in high definition and witnessed by nearly 200 people. You didn't make a mistake. You revealed your true character, and the world responded accordingly. The third domino fell that evening when Catherine's divorce attorney filed papers that not only dissolved Blake's marriage, but also invoked the morality clause in their prenuptial agreement, effectively transferring most of Blake's remaining personal assets to his wife, while leaving him responsible for the mounting legal bills and financial obligations that were accumulating faster than his depleted resources could cover them. Catherine had moved quickly to liquidate their joint assets and transfer the proceeds to accounts that Blake couldn't access, leaving him with enough cash to maintain his Queens apartment for perhaps 6 months, but nowhere near the resources necessary to fund the kind of legal defense that his criminal charges would require. The Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, the collection of luxury cars, and even Blake's yacht were all being sold to satisfy the terms of the divorce settlement and to generate the capital that Catherine would need to rebuild her social standing after the humiliation of being married to the most hated man in America. Blake spent that Friday night alone in his studio apartment drinking scotch that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent and scrolling through social media feeds that seemed to contain nothing but discussions of his racist outburst and speculation about what other revelations might emerge about his character and business practices. The hashtag Blake Whitmore is racist was trending worldwide, and enterprising internet users had created compilation videos of his meltdown that had been viewed more than 50 million times across all platforms. The comments sections of these videos were filled with expressions of satisfaction that an entitled rich man had finally faced consequences for his actions, but they also contained increasingly detailed discussions of Blake's business history and personal background. that revealed information he had never intended to make public. Former employees were sharing stories about his discriminatory hiring practices and abusive management style. Business partners were distancing themselves from deals they had completed with him years earlier. And even his college roommates were giving interviews about incidents that demonstrated his long-standing pattern of racist behavior. Blake realized with growing horror that his entire life was being retroactively examined through the lens of what the video had revealed about his character, and that everything he had ever said or done was now being interpreted as evidence of the prejudice and entitlement that had finally been exposed for the world to see. He wasn't just facing consequences for one moment of poor judgment. He was facing accountability for decades of behavior that had been enabled by his wealth and privilege, but had never been challenged by anyone with the power to stop him. The final domino fell on Saturday morning when Blake received a call from his cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Valdez, who had been monitoring Blake's heart health for several years and was concerned about the stress-related symptoms that had been developing since his public humiliation began. Dr. Valdez had reviewed Blake's recent test results and wanted to schedule a consultation to discuss what she described as significant cardiovascular concerns that require immediate attention. Blake almost laughed at the irony of needing cardiac care when the world's most respected heart surgeon was the same man he had threatened to destroy. But Dr. Valdez's next words eliminated any possibility of finding humor in his situation. Blake, she said, your stress levels and blood pressure readings suggest that you're at risk for a major cardiac event in the near future. I'm recommending that we schedule you for emergency surgery as soon as possible, and I want to refer you to the best cardiac surgeon available. Who would that be? Blake asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. Dr. Valdez consulted her notes before responding with the name that would complete Blake's understanding of exactly how completely the universe had conspired against him. The surgeon I'd recommend is Dr. Elijah Washington. He's currently in London, but he'll be back next week, and he's widely regarded as the most skilled cardiac surgeon in the world. I know his schedule is usually booked months in advance, but given the urgency of your situation, I think we could get you seen quickly. Blake hung up the phone and sat in silence for what felt like hours, processing the final piece of a puzzle that revealed the true scope of his predicament. He wasn't just facing criminal charges, financial ruin, and social exile. He was facing the possibility that his life might literally depend on the compassion of the man he had tried to destroy, the man whose dignity he had attacked, and the man whose brother controlled the financial resources that could have secured Blake's future if he hadn't chosen hatred over basic human decency. The apartment felt smaller than ever, as Blake contemplated a future where everything he had built was gone, where everyone he had known had abandoned him, and where his only hope for survival lay in the hands of someone he had treated with such contempt that asking for help would require a level of humility that Blake wasn't sure he was capable of achieving. 6 months after the incident on Flight 847, Blake Whitmore sat in the lobby of a Queens employment agency, filling out paperwork for minimum wage positions that he was overqualified for, but desperate enough to consider. His reflection in the agency's bathroom mirror revealed a man who had aged decades in half a year. His platinum blonde hair had grown out to show gray roots he could no longer afford to color. Professionally, his expensive suits had been replaced by department store clothing that hung awkwardly on his frame, and his face carried the hollow, haunted expression of someone whose entire understanding of himself and his place in the world had been systematically destroyed. The studio apartment in Astoria where Blake now lived cost $1,200 a month and was smaller than the walk-in closet in his former penthouse. But even that modest rent was becoming difficult to manage as his legal bills consumed what remained of his liquid assets, and his job prospects continued to evaporate with each Google search that potential employers inevitably conducted before making hiring decisions. The video of his racist outburst was still the first result that appeared when anyone searched his name, followed by dozens of news articles, opinion pieces, and social media discussions that had transformed him into a symbol of everything that was wrong with wealthy white privilege in modern America. Blake's criminal trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with a guilty plea to federal charges of interference with flight crew operations and civil rights violations, resulting in 18 months of probation, community service requirements, and fines that totaled more than $200,000. His attorney had negotiated the plea agreement to avoid prison time, but Blake sometimes wondered if incarceration might have been preferable to the ongoing humiliation of trying to rebuild his life under the constant scrutiny of a public that viewed him as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked racism. The employment counselor at the agency, a patient woman named Rosa Martinez, who had seen her share of people trying to restart their lives after personal catastrophes, reviewed Blake's application with the kind of diplomatic professionalism that suggested she was accustomed to helping clients whose expectations didn't match their current circumstances. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "I need to be honest with you about the challenges you're facing in the current job market. Your background in real estate development is impressive, but most employers in that field are going to be reluctant to hire someone with your public profile." Blake nodded with the resignation of someone who had heard similar explanations from dozens of potential employers over the past several months. "I understand," he said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance or entitlement that had once characterized his interactions with service professionals. "I'm willing to consider any position that would allow me to support myself and begin rebuilding my life. I know I'm not in a position to be selective about opportunities." Rosa consulted her computer screen, scrolling through available positions that might be appropriate for someone with Blake's complicated employment history. "There are some openings in customer service warehouse work and building maintenance that don't require extensive background checks. The pay isn't substantial, but it would give you employment history and references that might help you move toward better opportunities in the future." Blake accepted a list of potential positions that represented a complete inversion of his previous life jobs that paid hourly wages instead of annual salaries, positions that required physical labor instead of strategic thinking. Work that would make him invisible rather than powerful. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now seeking the kind of employment that he had once looked down upon, applying for positions that would be filled by exactly the type of people he had spent his career avoiding and dismissing. That evening, Blake sat in his small apartment eating a frozen dinner and watching the local news, which was featuring a story about the opening of a new children's cardiac wing at a hospital in the Bronx. The reporter was interviewing Dr. Elijah Washington, who looked exactly as calm and dignified as he had on the airplane 6 months earlier, discussing the cutting-edge surgical techniques that would be available to children whose families couldn't afford private medical care. Blake listened to Dr. Washington explain how the new facility would provide life-saving surgery to more than 500 children per year, funded by donations from medical organizations and private foundations that recognized the importance of making world-class healthcare accessible to all communities, regardless of economic circumstances. The doctor's voice carried the same quiet authority that Blake remembered from their brief interaction, but now Blake was able to hear the passion and commitment that had driven Dr. Washington to dedicate his life to serving others. "We believe," Dr. Washington said into the reporter's microphone, "that every child deserves the chance to live a full and healthy life, and that medical care should never be determined by a family's ability to pay or by any other factor beyond clinical need. This facility represents our commitment to treating every patient with the dignity and respect that all human beings deserve." Blake turned off the television and sat in the darkness of his apartment, thinking about the man he had threatened to destroy and the life he had chosen to build serving others, while Blake had focused exclusively on accumulating wealth and power for himself. The contrast between their priorities was so stark that Blake finally began to understand why the universe had seemed to conspire against him, not because he had been unlucky or unfairly targeted, but because he had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of person whose downfall represented justice rather than tragedy. The chest pains that had been troubling Blake for weeks intensified that night. A crushing sensation that felt like someone had placed a bowling ball on his sternum and was slowly increasing the pressure until breathing became difficult and movement became nearly impossible. Blake had been ignoring the symptoms because he couldn't afford medical care and because seeking treatment would require him to face the possibility that his life might depend on the compassion of doctors who knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Blake's heart attack, when it finally came, happened at 3:17 in the morning as he was lying in bed trying to find a position that would relieve the pressure in his chest. The pain exploded across his torso with the intensity of a lightning strike, and Blake's last conscious thought before the ambulance arrived was that he was about to die alone in a Queens studio apartment with no one to mourn his passing, and no legacy except a viral video that would forever define him as a symbol of hatred and entitlement. The emergency room physician at St. Mary's Hospital in Queens worked frantically to stabilize Blake's condition, but the damage to his heart was severe enough to require immediate transfer to a facility with specialized cardiac capabilities. Blake regained consciousness as he was being loaded into the ambulance for what the paramedics described as a priority transport to Manhattan Presbyterian. And through the haze of pain, medication, and oxygen deprivation, he heard one of the EMTs radio ahead to inform the receiving hospital that they were bringing in a 53-year-old male with massive MI needs immediate surgical intervention. Blake closed his eyes as the ambulance raced through Queens toward Manhattan, thinking about the cosmic joke that his life had become, and wondering if he would have the opportunity to make different choices if he somehow survived the next few hours. He had no way of knowing that the hospital where he was being taken was part of the same medical network where Dr. Elijah Washington practiced, or that the man he had tried to destroy might soon be faced with the decision of whether to save the life of someone who had treated him with such contempt and hatred. Dr. Elijah Washington was reviewing surgical notes in his office at Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital when his pager buzzed with the emergency code that indicated an incoming cardiac patient requiring immediate intervention. He glanced at his watch, 4:23 a.m., and mentally prepared himself for another night of life and death surgery, the kind of high-pressure situation that had defined his career and given meaning to every sacrifice he had made in pursuit of medical excellence. The patient information that appeared on his tablet as he walked toward the surgical suite was routine at first glance. 53-year-old male, massive myocardial infarction transferred from Queens after initial stabilization, no insurance, but qualifying for emergency indigent care. Elijah had performed hundreds of similar surgeries over the years, and he approached each case with the same methodical preparation, regardless of the patient's background, financial status, or personal circumstances. It wasn't until Elijah reviewed the full medical record and saw the patient's name, Blake Whitmore, that he paused in the hospital corridor, his mind racing as he processed the implications of what he was being asked to do. The man who had declared his refusal to fly with black people, who had threatened to destroy Elijah's career, who had been removed from an aircraft for his racist behavior, was now lying unconscious in a hospital bed with his life hanging in the balance. Elijah stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds, experiencing a flood of emotions that ranged from professional duty to personal vindication, from Christian compassion to very human anger at someone who had treated him with such public contempt. He thought about the Hippocratic oath he had taken more than 20 years earlier, the promise to do no harm that had guided every decision of his medical career. But he also thought about the hatred in Blake's eyes and the venom in his voice as he had made his discriminatory statements for everyone to hear. Dr. Sarah Chen. The resident on duty approached Elijah with the urgency that characterized all emergency cardiac cases. Dr. Washington, the patient, is prepped and ready for surgery. His condition is critical but stable, and we have everything we need to proceed with the repair. Are you ready to begin? Elijah looked at Dr. Chen, a young woman who reminded him of himself at the beginning of his career. idealistic and committed to the belief that medicine was about saving lives, regardless of any personal considerations that might complicate the clinical picture. Doctor, Chen Elijah said quietly, I need to inform you that I know this patient personally and our previous interaction was problematic. I want to make sure that my involvement in his care is appropriate given that history. Dr. Chen consulted Blake's chart, looking for any notation that might explain Dr. Washington's concerns, but finding nothing beyond the standard medical information that accompanied emergency admissions. Dr. Washington, if you're concerned about a conflict of interest, we could contact Dr. Martinez to handle the surgery, but his condition is deteriorating rapidly, and any delay could be fatal. Elijah thought about Dr. Martinez, an excellent surgeon who was currently at home with his family who would need at least 45 minutes to reach the hospital and prepare for surgery, and who might not arrive in time to save Blake's life if the damage to his heart continued to progress at its current rate. He thought about the oath he had taken, the promise that had defined his career and shaped his understanding of what it meant to be a physician in a world where personal feelings often conflicted with professional obligations. No, Elijah said. Finally, I'll handle the surgery. Prep the OR, and let's get started immediately. Blake regained consciousness 3 hours later in the cardiac intensive care unit, connected to monitors and machines that were keeping his damaged heart functioning while his body recovered from the trauma of major surgery. His vision was blurry from the anesthesia and pain medication, but he could make out the figure of a doctor sitting in a chair beside his bed, reading what appeared to be a medical journal in the soft light of the hospital room. When Blake's vision cleared enough to recognize his surgeon, his heart rate spiked dramatically, setting off alarms on the monitoring equipment that brought nurses rushing into the room to check his condition. Blake stared at Dr. Elijah Washington with an expression that mixed fear, confusion, gratitude, and shame in proportions that he couldn't begin to untangle in his medicated state. Dr. Washington, Blake whispered, his voice hoarse from the intubation that had been necessary during surgery. You operated on me. You saved my life. The statement carried the weight of disbelief, as if Blake couldn't process the idea that someone he had treated so terribly would choose to help him when he was most vulnerable. Elijah set down his journal and looked at Blake with the same calm expression he had maintained during their confrontation on the airplane. But now it was tempered with the professional compassion that characterized his bedside manner with all his patients. Mr. Whitmore, you had a massive heart attack that required immediate surgical intervention. The procedure was successful, but you'll need extensive recovery time and significant lifestyle changes if you want to avoid future cardiac events. Blake tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest and the weakness from surgery made movement almost impossible. Why, he asked, the single word carrying all the confusion and guilt that had been building in his mind since he regained consciousness. Why would you help me after what I said, after what I did? You could have let someone else handle the surgery. You could have walked away like the pilot did. Elijah considered Blake's question for a moment, thinking about the oath he had taken and the principles that had guided his career, but also thinking about the conversation he had had with his daughter the night before about the importance of forgiveness and the difference between justice and revenge. Mr. Whitmore, I took an oath to preserve life and relieve suffering regardless of any personal considerations. What happened between us on that airplane was wrong, but it doesn't change my responsibility as a physician. Blake closed his eyes, tears leaking from the corners as he processed the magnitude of what Dr. Washington had done for him and the grace that had been extended to someone who had shown no grace to others. I don't deserve this, Blake said softly. I don't deserve your help, your skill, your kindness. I was horrible to you, and you still saved my life. Mr. Whitmore, Elijah replied, his voice carrying the gentle firmness that he used with patients who were struggling with difficult diagnoses. Deservingness isn't something I consider when I'm deciding whether to perform surgery. I treat the patient in front of me, not their history or their character or their past mistakes. That's what being a doctor means." Blake opened his eyes and looked at Doctor Washington, seeing for the first time not the target of his prejudice, but a human being whose dedication to healing others had superseded any personal desire for revenge or vindication. "I'm sorry," Blake said, the words carrying more weight than any apology he had ever offered in his life. "I'm sorry for what I said, for how I treated you, for the hatred I showed you. I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." Elijah nodded slowly, accepting Blake's apology, not because it erased the harm that had been done, but because forgiveness was part of the healing process that extended beyond physical recovery to encompass the restoration of human dignity and the possibility of redemption. Mr. Whitmore, recovery from cardiac surgery is about more than repairing damage to your heart. It's about making changes that will allow you to live differently going forward. I hope you'll use this second chance wisely. As doctor, Washington prepared to leave the room to check on other patients. Blake called out one final question that revealed the depth of his transformation and his growing understanding of what it meant to receive grace from someone you had wronged. "Dr. Washington, how do I live with the fact that you saved my life when I tried to destroy yours? How do I find a way to deserve the gift you've given me?" Elijah paused at the door, his hand on the frame as he considered how to answer a question that went to the heart of what it meant to be human, in a world where hatred and love, justice and mercy existed in constant tension with one another. "You don't have to deserve it, Mr. Whitmore," he said finally. "You just have to decide what you're going to do with it." 2 years after his heart surgery, Blake Whitmore pushed a janitor's cart through the gleaming corridors of Terminal 4 at JFK Airport, his reflection in the polished floor showing a man who bore little resemblance to the wealthy real estate mogul who had once commanded boardrooms and wielded power over million-dollar deals. His gray custodial uniform was clean, and pressed his name tag simply read Art, and his face carried the quiet dignity that comes from honest work performed without pretense or the expectation of recognition. Blake had taken the airport custodial job 8 months after his release from the hospital, partly because it was one of the few positions available to someone with his public history, but mostly because working in the place where his old life had ended felt like an appropriate form of penance for the person he had once been. Every day he walked past Gate 12, where Flight 847 would have departed for London, and he remembered the man who had stood in that same space, believing that his wealth made him superior to other human beings. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on Blake. He was now performing the kind of work that he had once looked down upon, serving the same type of wealthy travelers who had once been his peers, but who now looked through him with the casual invisibility that the privileged reserved for service workers. But there was something liberating about the anonymity of his new life, something peaceful about work that had clear objectives and honest rewards, something healing about being judged by the quality of his effort rather than the size of his bank account. Blake's supervisor, Maria Santos, was a kind woman in her 50s who had been cleaning airports for 20 years and who treated her team with the respect and dignity that Blake had never shown to his own employees during his corporate career. Maria had hired Blake despite his background because she believed in second chances and because she recognized something in his demeanor that suggested genuine humility rather than the temporary shame of someone simply waiting for their circumstances to improve. Art, Maria said as she approached Blake near the security checkpoint, using the name he had chosen to distance himself from his previous identity. "There's a situation in the first-class lounge that needs attention. Some businessman spilled coffee and is making a scene about getting it cleaned up immediately. Can you handle it?" Blake nodded and pushed his cart toward the premium passenger lounge, a space that he had once frequented as a customer, but now entered only when summoned to address the messes left behind by people who assumed that their money gave them the right to treat service workers as personal servants. The businessman in question was standing near a leather chair, gesticulating wildly at the coffee stain on the carpet while berating a young airline employee who was clearly overwhelmed by his aggressive behavior. The man was perhaps 30 years old, wearing a suit that cost more than Blake's monthly salary, and speaking into his phone with the casual arrogance that Blake recognized from his own past behavior. "I don't care what it takes," the businessman was saying. "I need this handled immediately. I'm a platinum member, and this kind of service is completely unacceptable. Someone needs to lose their job over this." Blake approached the coffee stain with his cleaning supplies, working methodically to remove the spill while the businessman continued his tirade, apparently oblivious to the fact that his problem was being addressed by the very person he was complaining about. Blake had learned to make himself invisible during these interactions to focus on his work while wealthy passengers vented their frustrations on employees who had no power to solve their real problems. Finally, the businessman said, noticing Blake's presence, "Someone who actually knows how to do their job. And clean up that other mess over there too while you're at it." He gestured dismissively toward a newspaper that had fallen on the floor, his tone suggesting that Blake existed solely to address whatever minor inconveniences interrupted his day. Blake retrieved the newspaper without comment, but as he glanced at the headlines, one story caught his attention. "Local surgeon wins International Humanitarian Award for Cardiac Program, serving underserved communities." The accompanying photograph showed Dr. Elijah Washington accepting a medal from the World Health Organization for his work providing free heart surgery to children around the globe. The article described Dr. Washington's latest achievement, the establishment of mobile surgical units that could provide cardiac care in remote areas where children had never had access to the kind of medical expertise that Blake's own life had depended upon. The program had already saved more than 200 lives in its first year of operation, and Dr. Washington was planning to expand the initiative to reach even more communities that had been forgotten by traditional healthcare systems. Blake folded the newspaper carefully and placed it in his cleaning cart, but the businessman snatched it away with the casual entitlement that Blake had once displayed toward service workers. "Hey, that's mine," the man said sharply. "I wasn't finished reading it, and I don't appreciate the help taking my personal belongings." "I apologize, sir," Blake replied quietly. "I was just cleaning up the area as you requested." The businessman looked at Blake for the first time, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to place a face that seemed vaguely familiar. "Do I know you from somewhere?" "You look like someone I might have met before." Blake felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he realized that recognition was always a possibility, that someone might eventually connect the janitor named Art with the disgraced real estate mogul whose racist outburst had made international headlines. "I don't believe we've met," Sir Blake said carefully. "I just have one of those faces." The businessman shrugged and returned to his phone call, already forgetting about the service worker who had cleaned up his mess and returned to the invisible background where such people belonged. Blake finished his work and prepared to move on to his next assignment, but as he walked away, he heard the man's voice rising again as he continued his conversation. "I'm upgrading to first class for the London flight," the businessman was saying loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "I can't deal with sitting in coach with all those people. I need my space, I need my comfort, and I definitely need to be around passengers who understand proper travel etiquette." Blake paused in the doorway of the lounge, remembering his own words from 2 years earlier, hearing the echo of his own arrogance and entitlement in this stranger's casual dismissal of other passengers who didn't meet his standards for appropriate company. For a moment, Blake considered saying something, offering some kind of warning about the dangers of treating other people as inferior based on superficial characteristics. Instead, Blake walked quietly to his supply closet and retrieved a small piece of paper on which he wrote a simple message: "Be kind to everyone on your flight. You never know who you're sitting next to or what they might teach you about yourself." He left the note on the businessman's chair and returned to his work, hoping that perhaps one person might learn from his mistakes without having to experience the complete destruction that Blake had brought upon himself. That evening, as Blake rode the subway back to his small apartment in Queens, he thought about Dr. Washington's continued success and humanitarian work, and he realized that he felt genuinely happy about the recognition that the surgeon was receiving for his service to others. The jealousy and resentment that had once consumed Blake's thoughts had been replaced by something approaching gratitude, not just for the surgery that had saved his life, but for the example that Dr. Washington had provided of what it meant to use privilege and talent in service of something greater than personal advancement. Blake's apartment was still modest, still a far cry from the luxury he had once considered his birthright, but it had become a home rather than simply a place to sleep between the disasters that had once defined his existence. He had developed relationships with his neighbors, had learned to find satisfaction in small pleasures that didn't require wealth to enjoy, and had discovered that his sense of self-worth could be based on the quality of his character rather than the size of his bank account. As Blake prepared for sleep, he thought about the note he had left for the businessman and wondered whether small acts of kindness and quiet attempts to share what he had learned might be the beginning of a different kind of legacy than the one he had been building during his years of wealth and power. He wasn't seeking redemption or recognition. Those ships had sailed long ago, but he was discovering that there was meaning in work that served others and purpose in life that extended beyond the accumulation of money and status. Blake had no way of knowing that the businessman had found his note and had spent the entire flight to London thinking about its message, or that Dr. Washington continued to save lives every day without any thought of the man whose heart he had repaired during one long night of surgery. But Blake was learning that the most important changes happen in small, invisible moments when people choose kindness over cruelty, service over selfishness, and humility over the pride that had once destroyed everything he thought he valued. 3 years had passed since the incident on Flight 847, and the world had largely moved on to other stories of injustice, viral outrage, and fleeting internet fame. Dr. Elijah Washington continued his groundbreaking work at Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital, having recently been named the first African-American Surgeon General in New York State's history, while his mobile cardiac units had expanded to serve children in 12 countries across 3 continents. His name appeared regularly in medical journals and humanitarian award ceremonies, though he approached his growing recognition with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his response to Blake Whitmore's racist attack years earlier. Blake, now known to his co-workers and neighbors simply as Art, had established a routine of modest contentment working at JFK Airport, where his careful attention to detail and respectful interactions with travelers had earned him a reputation as one of the most reliable members of Maria Santos's custodial team. He lived in the same small apartment in Queens, had developed friendships with people who knew nothing of his previous life, and had found a kind of peace that his wealth had never provided during his years of chasing status and accumulating power over others. The transformation hadn't been dramatic or sudden. There had been no moment of spiritual awakening or grand gesture of redemption that might satisfy those who expected clear moral resolution from stories of fall and recovery. Instead, Blake's change had been gradual and quiet, built through thousands of small choices to treat others with respect, to find meaning in honest work, and to measure his worth by his daily actions rather than his financial achievements or social position. On the 3rd anniversary of Captain Torres's historic walk-off, Blake was cleaning near Gate 12 when he overheard 2 passengers discussing the incident that had made headlines around the world, their conversation prompted by a news program that was revisiting viral moments from previous years. "I still can't believe that pilot just walked off the plane," one traveler said to another. "That took real courage, standing up to a racist passenger like that, even when it cost everyone their flight." Blake listened to their discussion while continuing his work, feeling neither shame nor pride about their analysis of events he had set in motion, but rather a quiet acceptance of the consequences that had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where everyone's actions affected everyone else in ways both seen and unseen. The ultimate lesson of Blake Whitmore's story wasn't about punishment or redemption, justice or forgiveness. but about the simple truth that how we treat each other, especially those we perceive as having less power than ourselves, reveals who we truly are beneath the superficial markers of success that our society uses to measure human worth. Doctor. Washington had demonstrated that true strength lies in extending dignity to others, even when they refuse to offer it in return, while Blake had learned that real transformation requires not just acknowledging our failures, but choosing every day to become someone worthy of the second chances that life occasionally provides to those who approach them with genuine humility and a commitment to serve something greater than their own comfort and convenience.